So here we have kind of the topics that we'll be covering today. We'll talk a little bit about key components of a data-driven DEI strategy. We'll talk about leveraging data for both DEI and pay equity. We'll talk a bit about intersectionality and gender equity. And then we'll talk, of course, about pay transparency, since that's, of course, a very hot topic right now. But with that, I'm gonna kick us off and put Aniela in the hot seat for a moment, just to ask her the first question. So Aniela, how about sharing your thoughts on the key components of an evidence-based DEI strategy?
Thank you, Gail, and thank you so much for having me today with you. It's a real pleasure to be able to contribute to this conversation with one of the most accomplished pay equity experts that I had the pleasure of meeting already many years ago. And it's a great honor to continue this conversation with you today, Gail. So,
as well with you, Aniela. You are also quite an icon in the world of gender equity. So it's really wonderful to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. So let's go into the key components of the D&I strategy. And one of the things that it is very important when talking about the D&I strategy, we have to think that a D&I strategy should not be different from any business critical strategy. So if you look at the key components of any sound business strategy, I believe that we are talking about three fundamental things. And this applies one-to-one to any successful D&I strategy. The first one is, where do we stand and why? The second element is, where do we want to go and why? And the third element is how to get from where we are to where we want to go. And what is very important is that, of course, where do we stand and why, and where do we want to go and why? This needs to be ingrained in a very solid understanding and data-driven analysis, again, just like any other business strategy. In addition to these three components, I would say that there are three enablers of a D&I strategy that is based on this clear understanding of where we are, where we want to go, and how to get there. And these enablers are, first and foremost, I know that we talk a lot about it, but I think that we cannot speak enough about how important it is to have the support of the top leadership team for D&I as a key strategic priority for the organization. It is vital. Conversations are dramatically different and progress is dramatically different when this commitment is or is not in the mix. The second element is resources allocated to implement the strategy. Sometimes resources are abundant, sometimes less so, but there needs to be a set of dedicated resources, people, budgets, both, to support the implementation of this strategy. And third, very important, accountability mechanisms for progress. So I would say that the three components with the three enablers of the support of the top leadership team, the resources, and the accountability mechanisms are the key components of a successful D&I strategy.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for kicking us off with that, because I think having the support of leaders is absolutely vital if you really want to make progress and have anything that really isn't performative. You really need leaders to buy in and to own the outcomes as well. And so in terms of kind of how I might approach this question, I love a framework. And so when I think about a DEI strategy, and I think this is actually a really nice sort of follow on from your more strategic discussion. I'm getting more into the practical world of things. So for me, I like the idea of creating a framework. And I think in my mind, and I think this kind of speaks a lot to what you were saying about where are we now, where do we want to go, and how do we get there? So I think a framework can actually help create that kind of infrastructure to help you understand where you are, where you're headed, and what kind of interventions you might want to design to ensure you are able to move in the right direction. So the way I think about a framework is, one is I like to have some basic understanding of representation, right? So and representation really helps you understand kind of what is the current state of diversity in your organization. And that's kind of the piece of, an important piece of the puzzle in terms of where are we now. The second is talent dynamics. So I think it's really important to understand kind of based on your recent talent dynamics. So for example, based on your recent, hiring, promotion, retention dynamics, where is the diversity of your workforce going based on what you've done recently? So if you think about where you are now as an organization, where you are now is based on all of those historical hiring and promotion and retention decisions and actions. And so if you want to understand where are we going, well, you could apply that same logic and say, well, based on our historical talent dynamics, if we don't do anything else, if we don't do anything to kind of intervene, this is what we expect to happen over the next few years in terms of representation. And it really helps you understand, okay, well, are we moving in the direction we would like to go? So for example, if your objective is to increase the representation of women at the manager level, for example, when you look to see where are we expected to go over the next 3 to 5 years, based on those hiring and retention and promotion patterns, are we expecting to see an increase in the representation of women at the manager level? And if not, what are the levers that we can pull to increase representation or at least prevent it from declining? So you can basically look to see, do we have inequities in our hiring rates? Do we have inequities in promotion? Do we have inequities in retention? At what level? And that can really help you understand at a very detailed level, where are we going if we don't intervene? And then basically, once you have a better understanding of what levers we can pull, then you can start focusing more like, oh, it's really a hiring issue. Oh, I see, it's a promotion issue. Oh, it's a retention issue. Then you can start designing interventions to specifically address that particular lever, essentially. And then, a third part of the framework, of course, in my mind is pay equity, because that's sort of, in my mind, the very foundational, ensuring that people are paid fairly, but also employee experience, right? So, we talk about a lot of the, measuring things like hires and promotions and exits, but also measuring employee sentiment and getting a sense of what is your workforce experiencing, whether that's through surveys and focus groups. And then lastly, in terms of kind of this framework that I have in my mind, are really the policies and practices that an organization designs. And that really provides kind of the infrastructure, right? Because those policies and practices are kind of the rules of the game that an organization follows in making decisions around things like hiring and creating hiring and promotion, practices and processes. So to me, those sort of 5 things, understanding representation, your talent dynamics, your pay equity situation, how are your employees experiencing, your work environment, and your policies and practices kind of together are really important components of an evidence-based DEI strategy.
And Gail, in what you are saying, what I love about your framework is this very scientific and disciplined approach. I think that one of the things that we keep hearing is this sentiment that D&I in the workplace, it's more an art than a science. And yes, of course, we are talking about human beings in their workplaces. So there is a component which is highly intangible and highly subjective about that, naturally so. But there is also a very structured and disciplined approach to that. So, which leads me to ask you, actually, how have you seen this data and evidence-based approach to actually have a positive impact on the D&I outcomes as compared to maybe less structured and evidence-based approaches?
Sure. So, one of the things that, and this also touches on some of what we'll probably talk about a little later, is that I think there's a lot of sort of misconceptions about what DEI even is. And
right.
I think a lot of people and organizations really think that it's really focused on things like training, like, oh, we have an unconscious bias training, and cross our fingers that the training will, encourage managers to make unbiased decisions around things like pay and hiring and promotion. But this kind of assumes that just simply teaching people about bias eliminates bias from their, decision making and their attitudes. And there's just really not very good evidence that that's likely to happen. Instead, it's really more important to create sort of those policies and practices and guidelines that direct people and move people toward more unbiased decision making. And so in terms of, again, you sort of read me right when you said I like to take a very disciplined approach. So just like I like a framework, a DEI framework, I also think it's important to have an actual measurement strategy. And to basically, for, like you mentioned earlier, for accountability purposes, right? So as part of that measurement strategy, it really allows you to kind of directly measure your organization's workforce dynamics and, address any problem areas. As I mentioned earlier, the workforce dynamics that you have, unless you intervene, those dynamics are going to continue to play out and are going to create your future workforce. So I recommend for every organization that they really track, things like hire rates, promotion rates, retention rates for different demographic groups by career level, because otherwise you really don't even understand the scope of what you're dealing with. It could be, for example, that you really have no issues with hiring at maybe more junior levels. And maybe you're actually have no promotion issues or retention issues at more junior levels. But maybe as you move up the hierarchy, that's where you start to see some issues around promotion. Maybe women are less likely to be promoted compared to men, or other differences based on demographic groups. So I think that, if an organization really wants to create kind of an evidence-based DEI strategy and look at important, to sort of drive DEI outcomes, one of the most important ways is really to measure things like your talent dynamics and measure your hire, promotion, and retention rates by level and track those over time. And then you can start developing some interventions. So for example, let's say you find in implementing this measurement strategy that you find that women are less likely to be promoted into the manager level. Then you can take that a step further and understand, well, what are the experiences associated with promotion into the manager level? And does everybody have access to those opportunities? For example, you might find that those that have mentors or sponsors are more likely to be promoted into the manager level. But you may also find in your organization that maybe men are more likely than women to have a mentor or a sponsor. In that case, you can design an intervention. So you develop a program to ensure everyone has, equal access to mentors and sponsors. And that will, presumably over time help close those promotion gaps. But I think it really all starts with, measuring those talent dynamics and really understanding how those are driving your diversity outcomes, because those are really at the core of your the outcomes that you would like to see. If you want to see increased representation, you need to understand your talent flows and where there are inequities.
That's right. And Gail, in hearing you speak about, this kind of, mapping the career flows and designing the interventions accordingly, and not hoping that things will happen naturally, because they do not, it just makes me think of what a very distinguished professor of the Harvard Kennedy School, Professor Iris Bonet, who is a behavioral economist, keeps saying, that what works is to debias processes, as opposed to attempting the impossible, which is debiasing human minds, debias the processes. And this is exactly what you are describing. So ensuring that the interventions are meant to create equity for all. So whenever a human mind, an individualized decisions might have introduced a blip in the system, let's call it like that, then the process comes and corrects that, which is probably one of the most effective ways to systemically address biases in the workplace.
Yeah, and I love the that notion of debiasing the process. I think that's a great way of a very succinct way of thinking about it. So now let's turn our attention to data. So what do you think? What data do you think organizations really should be collecting if they want to be able to effectively assess their DEI efforts?
And Gail, you mentioned them earlier, so I will simply summarize what you have said, because I believe that organizations need to look at both quantitative and qualitative data. They need to look at both processes and outcomes in terms of measurement. So in terms of the quantitative outcome-oriented measures, you said it's representation. Very often we do not think of representation as being an outcome indicator, but it is. As you said, where we are in representation today, it's a result of a certain number of decisions that we have taken in the past. And we don't change representation by changing representation. We need to intervene in the career flows. So representation is an absolute outcome indicator, quantitative one. Then, of course, pay equity. Are there any portions of the gross pay gap which cannot be explained objectively other than by a set of personal characteristics of your employees? Also, pay equity, it's an outcome indicator. Again, it's a decision of it's a result of a certain number of decisions taken over time, very quantitative. These are I would call them the tip of the iceberg. But then, in order to address them and to design effective interventions, we need to go into more qualitative, process-oriented ones. As you said, what are the policies and practices that we have in place that build this infrastructure of equity, that ensure equitable career flows for everybody? Because if they are not in place, then the question is, if the results are positive in representation in pay equity, the question is how sustainable those results are. Because they don't seem to be supported by an infrastructure of equity. So maybe there is a very good top leadership team that cares about this topic, and then they push for results, off they go, off the results go with them. So, and then if the results are not where they should be right now, but we see that the infrastructure of equity is getting stronger and stronger, we have all reasons to be optimistic that the results will improve over time. And of course, the last, very qualitative, very subjective, but crucially important, the inclusiveness of the culture, the voices of the employees themselves. And I know that we tend to think, well, it's subjective, and that experience, it might or might not be substantiated by some of the quantitative data. For example, the perceptions of pay equity and pay fairness might diverge from the reality of the analysis. But those experiences, for as subjective as they are, they will drive the engagement of the employee in the workplace, and their engagement will drive their performance and will also drive the way in which they will speak about their workplace and about the organization that they work for. So, as you said, looking at representation, looking at pay equity in the realm of the quantitative outcomes, looking at the effectiveness of policies and practices to ensure equitable career flows, and looking at inclusion and the inclusiveness of the culture in the qualitative, process-oriented sphere, I would say that they are the four cornerstones of any solid, sound, sustainable approach to workplace D&I.
Yeah, and I really like the idea. I mean, I completely agree that you really do need that employee experience piece to have an understanding of the inclusion part. But also, I mean, you might have completely equitable processes and systems, right? You might be able to show that we have, no pay inequities, no promotion inequities, no retention or hiring inequities. If your employees don't believe that, that is going to drive their decision making, right? Whether in terms of their engagement, in terms of whether they decide to stay. So, their perception is equally important. And that's why it's so important for organizations to build that trust so that when they do, for example, share information about their pay equity situation and things like that, that it's actually believed. I think there's sometimes a disconnect where companies will make public statements about their DEI situation, whether it's pay equity or representation, and it doesn't ring true for some reason for the employee population or certain parts of the employee population, maybe because of historical issues that were maybe their understanding of or their experience of the workplace is somehow different. And it's if you don't get their buy-in, then it's not really going to be a successful strategy. So it's not just about the numbers. You have to also really focus on employee sentiment. And one thing I just wanted to I know we have a lot of questions to get to. One thing I wanted to raise is that in terms of the type of data companies should be thinking about, I think and this maybe gets to the intersectionality, I do think organizations probably need to start thinking about collecting more information about their employees. That's not an easy task. It's actually a really difficult to start asking employees very personal questions about whether it's, their, sexual orientation, gender identity, their disability status. These are sensitive questions, but I do think that that's something that organizations are really, to take that intersectional view, are going to have to, try and tackle. And of course, that means working with legal, trying to understand what what information you're allowed to collect in what countries, and then also a fairly substantial communication and change management exercise to explain to your workforce why you want to collect this information, what you're going to do with this information, how you're going to protect the privacy of this information. But I think we're kind of moving in that direction where just looking at gender, for example, or race or ethnicity is probably not going to be sufficient. That, creating a fuller picture of, kind of the many different dimensions of diversity is something that organizations, I think, are going to have to tackle if they really want to kind of make substantial progress on their DEI, strategy. So moving on to our next question. Actually, I think that's a question that I was going to answer. But maybe I'll ask you this one first, because I just spent so much time talking. So in terms of ensuring that your DEI strategies are kind of lead to actionable results versus kind of symbolic or performative, gestures, I have some thoughts of my own, but I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on, how organizations can really tackle that.
And I think, Gail, that of course there are many many ways to measure the impact and the effectiveness of a strategy. But if I was to choose two indicators that will help us understand if real change is happening in the organization, then one would be how diverse and increasingly diverse your talent pipeline looks like. Not only across levels of responsibility, but also across types of roles. Who is in core function? Do we get more men into support functions? Do we get more women in P&L responsibility roles, for example? So the diversity of your pipeline across types of jobs, across levels of responsibilities, across managerial responsibilities, so supervisors, people manager roles versus individual contributors. I think that that is one unbeatable sign that whatever is being put in place, it's working. And then the other measure, it's really the inclusiveness factor. If your pipeline gets more diverse and your culture is getting more inclusive, you must be doing something right. And when it comes to inclusion, it is generally a word that has a very large sphere of application. And again, we do see that we come close to this word of inclusion with this delicacy of something that cannot be measured. And of course, because that is our line of work, Gail, you and mine, to measure and to quantify. I just wanted to mention a very interesting study that was conducted by Bain & Company in saying what is inclusion and what drives inclusion. And they conducted this very comprehensive study across different countries, across different industries. And while the drivers of the sentiment of inclusion remain very diverse across industries and across regions, there was a very distinct and reduced set that predicted the feeling of inclusion across companies and across industries. And they were growth and career opportunities and receiving constructive feedback. So to the extent to which employees felt that they are receiving the type of feedback that they need to develop in the organization, and they receive career development opportunities, which sometimes are vertical, sometimes are lateral moves, but something that develops them. That was very strongly correlated with the feeling of inclusion. So I think that these would be my two favorite ones. The diversity of the pipeline across type of jobs, across levels of responsibility, and the inclusiveness of the culture as measured by this sentiment and this experience of the employees that they get the feedback that they need and they get the career opportunities that they deserve.
Yeah, and I think what I really like about that is it really lends itself back to that measurement, strategy. I mean, these are all things that can be measured and tracked, and you can measure it, by leader, right? I mean, and I think getting, also an important part of making sure results are, actionable rather than simply symbolic is that commitment from leaders and also their accountability, right? So that it's very clear that the outcomes that we're talking about, whether it's representation and pipeline and, different, roles and who has access to roles, that those are owned by the leaders. It's not owned by HR. It's not HR's responsibility. And now HR is very important in providing some of the guidelines and the frameworks and the tracking and all of that. But ultimately, really, leaders need to own their DEI outcomes, whether that's pay outcomes, promotion, hiring, retention, pipeline. To me, that's really where you can, if they start to take personal ownership of that, and then you track it and hold them accountable, to, hey, why aren't we seeing any improvement? And working, of course, closely with leaders to develop, strategies and interventions to address whatever inequities, are identified. But I think that's a really important piece of that. In terms of kind of, how would you recommend measuring the success of a DEI strategy over time? Do you have any kind of advice for those out there who are kind of maybe have something in place but want to have a better understanding of how they can measure it over time?
So I think, Gail, companies are in very different stages of their journey. So what we are always saying is that wherever you are in your journey, take your baseline measure. You might be in the very beginning in formulating your strategy. You might be in that very frustrating place where you have put things in action, but you don't get the results that you want. Or you might feel that you actually are ready to reap the success and the benefits of your investment. So wherever you are, have a very clear measurement of your baseline. And then keep an eye on those indicators and how they evolve over time. It's exactly like, if you think of the financial statements, right? This is what they do. They have a very clear set of material indicators. There are many indicators, but they have a material set of indicators that matter. And then from year to year, you see, how do we compare to the year prior? Does this indicator went up or down, and why? And I think that is exactly the same, having this discipline. And one of the things that is really very important is that we see that organizations are, in some indicators, quite disciplined in measuring their evolution over time. But when with some indicators, there is this very fatalistic approach in saying, oh, we measured the representation again here, and the numbers look as bad this year as they looked the year before. Too bad, there's nothing that we can do. The legislation, the available talent pool, that stops us, right? So I think that it is very important to feel that you actually own this possibility of progress. And in saying, yes, of course, we have been measuring it for a while, and then we do not see progress. But let's have a meaningful conversation. Let's unpack that and say, why? Where are we not making progress? Is it in our retention? Is it in our hiring? Is it in our promotion? Is it in the access to those career critical assignments? Is it in access to sponsorship, to mentoring? Where exactly do we keep doing the same things, which will eventually lead to the same result? And trust that, the organization can own that agenda. Maybe not to the full extent. The business dictates the sizes of those hiring flows, of those promotion flows. We cannot, from one year to another in certain areas, we cannot do disruptive changes. But there are some areas where we can do incremental changes, and there are some areas where we can disrupt and think, well, what if we would look at it from a different perspective? So I think that this combination of measuring something over time and feeling confident and empowered that there is a way to influence the trajectory of that measurement and being accountable for it, it's very important.
Yeah, and I just like I love a framework, I love a scorecard. So
right.
I think you can create a DEI scorecard for each leader, and it has very specific, metrics on there, things like promotion, that's where you'd find your promotion rates for different demographic groups, percent of different demographic groups having mentors or sponsors, and then, using some sort of red, yellow, green to indicate the directionality, like, is this headed in the right direction? Is this headed in the wrong direction? So I'm all for, a scorecard to kind of help keep leaders on, focused on the things that matter, just like they would on a financial statement, so I completely agree with that. So maybe we move on to kind of a discussion a bit more about pay equity.
That's right. Let's do that. And I think, Gail, there, I would like maybe to put together maybe two themes and two topics. First of all, how do you go about assessing gender and intersectional equity in pay? And then maybe on the back of that, what is your take on the power of the increasing set of compliances around pay transparency and in some cases pay equity and pay transparency, how this regulatory pressure can actually help or hinder the efforts that companies are doing to establish pay equity?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And just kind of as a reminder, and so if we are thinking about how to assess, pay equity from an intersectional perspective, first, I just want to remind those in the audience that, pay equity ultimately really is the practice of ensuring employee pay is based on, legitimate, compensable, non-discriminatory factors. So things like skill, effort, responsibility level, working conditions. And, the gold standard way of measuring pay inequities and doing a pay equity analysis is by using what we call multiple regression analysis. So hate to get a little technical, but I'm gonna go there a little bit. And multiple regression lets us understand the relationship between a particular outcome that we're interested in. So for example, could be compensation, and many factors or multiple factors that are hypothesized to be related to that outcome. So in terms of how we apply multiple regression in terms of pay equity is we start with compensation as our outcome of interest, and we add to this regression analysis all the relevant compensable factors that we believe should impact pay and should drive pay differences. So things like career level, what role you're in, your seniority, your performance. And then in addition to these legitimate compensable factors, then we also add in our demographic factors. So things like gender, race and ethnicity, or any other demographic characteristic that we're interested in understanding. And we're looking to see if after we account for these compensable factors that we would expect to drive pay differences, do we see that gender and race or other demographic characteristics are statistically related to compensation? Ideally, we find that they are not. But if we find those instances where there seems to be some statistical relationship between our demographic factors and compensation, then we need to put in place a remediation strategy to address these inequities. And in terms of kind of that intersectional view, what I would say is that really an intersectional analysis simply means that when you are running your regression analysis, you include all of the demographic characteristics you'd like to examine in the same statistical analysis. And this is, I've seen it done very differently elsewhere, but this is something that at least at Trusaic we're very focused on, and that is when you're developing your regression model, you don't want to just look at the relationship between, let's say, gender and pay, and then run a separate analysis looking at the relationship between race and ethnicity and pay. You want to include both gender and race and any other, dimensions of diversity that you're interested in that same analysis. Because if you run separate analyses, let's say a separate gender analysis, a separate race analysis, you might actually mismeasure your pay inequities. You might think something is due to gender when it's actually due to race, and vice versa. And you may end up basically mismeasuring your pay inequities and making, inappropriate remediation, decisions based on that. And so that's kind of what we strongly recommend, is that to really take that intersectional view, you want to make sure you're including all of those different dimensions of diversity in your one analysis. And just to give you some context, Trusaic recently partnered with MSITE, and we did a survey on kind of the current state of pay equity policies and practices. And we were a little surprised that only about 40% of responding organizations that are doing some sort of pay equity analysis are using multiple regression. More than 45% are using more basic statistics, like looking at average or median pay. And there's a lot of problems with this approach. This sort of simplified analysis, analytical approach can actually lead you to incorrectly identify pay inequities, or more likely, you might fail to identify, pay inequities that are actually, a problem. So hopefully that wasn't too long of an answer but there's a lot of complexity around kind of taking that intersectional view. And to your second point about, kind of the increase in pay transparency, I think that organizations are recognizing that the norm is very quickly shifting toward greater pay transparency, but not all organizations are really ready to be transparent.
Right.
So I think getting your pay equity situation in order is going to position an organization to be more transparent. So if you're not quite ready to be transparent, you want to make sure that you're identifying and addressing pay inequities so that you feel more comfortable being more transparent in the future.
That's right. And Gail, just keeping an eye on the watch as we are heading towards the end of this conversation, I would add to that of course another element that brings and prepares organizations to be ready to be transparent is of course voluntary mechanisms such as certification. So at Edge certification, this is exactly what we do through a voluntary mechanism, providing organizations with a very clear set of measurements. So this is we make a choice in saying, in a world of limited resources, this is what matters. This is how performance looks like. And these are the independent third-party mechanisms for validation that will make your work, your progress, your achievements visible and credible. And I think that this kind of voluntary mechanisms that can be consistently applied across geographies and across regions are very good ways to keep organizations in a certain rhythm of transformation, bring visibility and credibility to their work, and create this culture of transparency and accountability.